It was that time of the year when mornings were almost completely dark. Of course, I didn't want to be up this early, but my son Joey had to go to school. So I made my sweet 8-year-old kid some breakfast, and we were out the front door by 6:30 a.m. I was about to open my car door when something very peculiar caught my eye. Across the street in our old neighbor's driveway, they moved about a couple weeks ago and left the house vacant, was a single car. But not just any car. It was a silver Nissan Sentra, just like mine. I was curious as to who could be the driver of it. Did someone come to buy the house? I looked closer and I swear I saw a silhouette of a person sitting in the driver's seat. I brushed it off and got in the car. However, Joey was a bit more curious than I was. "Daddy, why is there a car that looks just like yours?" "I have no clue, son," I replied, and we drove off to Joey's school. When I came back home to get ready for work, I noticed that the car was gone. I'm probably just being paranoid, I told myself. The next morning, however, the car was back. But there was something else different. Joey was standing outside next to our car when I came out. He pointed across the street. "Daddy, who's that man waving at me from that car?" I swallowed hard as I looked over to the car identical to mine and saw a solitary hand waving from behind the windshield. It seemed to be in a frantic motion as well. I was freaked out by this. "Come on, Joey, we gotta go," I quickly commanded, and we were once again off to Joey's school. Like the day before, the car was gone when I returned home. The next morning, Joey once again beat me to the car. But instead of opening the door, he once again pointed across the street, more nervous than before. "Daddy, who is that man standing in the driveway over there?" I looked across to see a man wearing a jacket and jeans. His haircut was somewhat similar to mine, but more matted to his head. I shouted out to him, "What do you want?" He didn't answer, but continued to stand there with his hands in his pockets. "What are you doing here?" I shouted. He just stood there without moving, at least for the first few seconds. Then he pulled his hand from his pocket and reached his arm out towards us, continuing to stand where he was. "Joey, get in the car now," I panicked. Joey did what I said, and we got out of that driveway as quickly as possible. Once again, I returned home to see no car or man in that driveway. After I parked my car, I decided to march over there and find out if anyone was staying in that house. I banged on the door several times, frustratingly, but I couldn't get anyone to come to the door, and no sound could be heard from inside. I was so confused as well as furious about this whole situation. Who was stalking me and my son? I was soon about to find out. The next morning, Joey and I came out of the house simultaneously. Joey and I looked over across the street to see the car that resembled mine. But this time, there was no man in the driveway. Joey immediately climbed into my car after seeing it. I looked closer at the other car's windshield. Nobody seemed to be in the driver's seat this time. As I was trying to make out a silhouette in there, I suddenly heard a scream from Joey. My spell was broken as I frantically opened my car door, and when I looked inside, I was terrified. Joey wasn't in the car. I slammed my car door and called out to him, looking everywhere in the front yard for him. He was nowhere to be seen. Then after looking for what seemed like forever but was really only a couple minutes, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt like I was not alone in my driveway. I knew it wasn't Joey. It was something else. Something that gave me chills. I turned around only to find an adult man's hand wrap around my throat. I recognized from the man's jacket, jeans, and matted hair that he was the mysterious figure that has been stalking me and Joey. I punched and kicked and tried to work my way out of the man's grasp, but to no avail. I gave one final kick to the man's leg and I broke free, but not for long as the figure instantly recoiled and charged at me. I ran towards my front porch and switched on the light, which was bright enough to where I hoped I could maybe blind him, but he only slightly flinched and continued his pursuit. He managed to grip his hands around my neck once more, and in the lit front porch, I could make out the man's face. As I struggled to escape his grip, I found myself staring at myself. The man looked exactly like me, except his hair and face were soaked in sweat, and there was this insane and angry look on his face. His grip became tighter and tighter around my throat. My vision was beginning to blur. I knew this was my end. Then I blacked out. I woke up to find myself in the driver's seat of my car. I couldn't move at all. I was frozen in place with my hands gripped on the steering wheel. My hands felt glued to it. I looked out to see there was still a very dark blue sky outside. But then I realized something horrifying. I wasn't in my car. I could see my own house from across the street. My actual car parked neatly in the driveway. On one side of it stood my son Joey, and on the other was that man. I instantly began screaming for my son. "Joey! Joey, I'm in here! Can you hear me?" I struggled to detach my hands from the steering wheel until I finally managed to release my grip. I still couldn't move any other part of my body from the waist down. It didn't matter at the moment. If I could just get Joey's attention, that was enough. I tried screaming his name again while slamming my hand on the car horn, but the horn wouldn't work, and my screams were in vain. I started to frantically wave out at Joey, hoping he would see my hand through the windshield. Joey looked over and saw me, but the expression on my boy's face, it was that of confusion, mixed with slight fear. After a couple of seconds, he reached out his arm to point at me. Somehow from across the street, from inside the car, I could hear my son's voice speak. "Daddy, who's that man waving at me from that car?" I froze then and there. My identical self from the other side of my car looks over in my direction and starts staring at me with the most sinister expression on his face. Then he responds with, "Come on, Joey, we gotta go." Joey suddenly climbs into my car without a care. At that point, I broke down completely, screaming for my son, desperate for him to come to his senses. But it was no use. Before the man got into my car, he looked over at me again, with this chilling smile on his face. Then he brought his hand up to wave at me. Then he got into the car, which came out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I was throwing the biggest fit of my life. This couldn't be happening. I was trapped in this vehicle with no way to escape. I buried my face in my hands and I leaned against the wheel. Sweat was pouring down my face, for there was hardly any oxygen left in here, and I had worked my body to the max trying to free myself. My hair was soaked and matted to my head and face. All I could do was cry, knowing that man was now Joey's new father, and Joey probably doesn't even know who I am, other than some creepy figure across the street.